introduce you now to Rob Bowman, who is a professor of ethnomusicology at York University in Toronto. Rob is the writer of a very influential book called Soulville, USA, The Story of Stax Records. It is the definitive history of Stax Records, and everybody I know in Memphis has huge respect and admiration for Rob and the work that he's done and the light that he's shined on that music scene. He's been nominated for 5 Grammy Awards. He won a Grammy Award for a 10-CD box set called The Complete Stax Volt Singles Volume 3. And I love the fact that Rob has been quoted as saying, "All music is created equally." He's also very involved in the Canadian music scene, a member of Juno boards and the Maple Blues Awards committees, and he's here to talk to us and tell us about the Canadian influence of Woody Guthrie and This Land Is Your Land. Please welcome Dr. Rob Bowman.
You can see my talk, This Land Is Your Land, Woody Guthrie, The Travelers, and Canadian Nationalism. And I'd be totally remiss to say one more word without pointing out Jerry Gray. Jerry Gray's in the house today. Jerry Gray's a founding member of the Travelers. He still leads the Travelers, and he'll be speaking on the panel after this. And I know Jerry well enough. You've got that banjo you're going to be playing. So my hats go off to Jerry Gray. And a lot of this research is based around interviews I did with Jerry and other members of the Travelers 8-9 years ago, centered around a Sony CD that we decided needed to happen because the Travelers were an unknown story and they needed to be known. All right, before there was a Canadian music industry, the Travelers were blazing a pathway. Before Canada had its own national anthem, the Travelers were waving the flag, writing and singing a Canadianized version of This Land Is Your Land. Before multiculturalism became a buzzword that defined the reality of what it meant to be Canadian, the Travelers were singing Ukrainian, Native Indian, French, Israeli, African, and Italian songs, as well as material from at least 15 other countries. Before the 1960s served to imbue much of contemporary youth with a political consciousness, the Travelers' repertoire was rife with songs of social significance. Simply put, when the Travelers formed in late summer 1953, they were significantly ahead of their time. And despite such prodigious accomplishments, the group's legacy remains one of the best kept secrets in the history of Canadian music. Now I think, before we go any further, even though I know Jerry will play later, we need to hear a little bit of their version of This Land Is Your Land.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from Bona Vista to the Vancouver Island, from the Arctic Circle to the Great Lake water. This land was made for you and me. As I went walking.
All right, it gives you a sense of what the Travelers sounded like. The Travelers' early history is fascinating and centers around the left-leaning center of Toronto's downtown working Jewish class population. In the mid to late 1920s, members of this community formed the first branch of an organization initially known as the Labour League. Subsequent branches were formed in Montreal, Vancouver, and Winnipeg. Analogous to and allied with similar Jewish organizations in the United States, the Labour League was a leftist cultural and community group whose members included a number of Communist Party members and Soviet sympathizers. With the advent of Canada's anti-communist laws following World War II, the Labour League found itself under intense government scrutiny. In fact, the Montreal branch of the organization was actually shut down under the authority of Quebec's infamous padlock law, which gave the police the right to literally padlock any home or institution they merely suspected of sedition. So much for the land of the free, right? We like to think we're better than the US, we're really not. Responding to these pressures, in 1946, the Labour League's name was changed to the United Jewish People's Order, UJPO. The families of all the original Travelers were intricately involved with the Labour League and then subsequently the UJPO. For tenor singer, banjo player, and current group leader Jerry Gray, born 1933, the Labour League was literally part of his life virtually from birth. As a cultural and social organization, one of the Labour League's main activities was its community choir, whose membership included Gray's mother, as well as the mother of fellow Travelers Sid Doge and Jerry Goodis. Formed in 1940 as the Toronto Jewish Folk Choir, throughout the next 2 decades, the group rivaled the 150-voice Toronto Benson Choir, both in terms of critical acclaim and commercial success, regularly selling out Toronto's fabled 2,700-seat Massey Hall. Among Gray's earliest memories are recurring images of attending his mother's Sunday afternoon choir rehearsals, where he would sit quietly for an hour and a half while the choir sang a mixture of Yiddish folk tunes and socially conscious songs. Neither the sounds nor the lyrics of this rich body of folk music was lost on Gray. As you can see, the UJPO was publishing songbooks at the time. In the mid-1930s, the Labour League bought Eldorado Park, about a half hour north of Toronto, and renamed it Camp Nivelt, meaning Camp New World. The camp had two sections, one for children and one for adult. The children's section was designed to provide summer vacations for working-class youth, whose parents would pay on a sliding scale depending on their income. The adult section started with tents and eventually included cabins which Toronto Jewish families would rent for family vacations. Jerry Gray was literally going to the camp from the first summer it opened, both on a weekend and extended vacation basis. As cars were few and far between for working-class families in the late 30s and early 1940s, transportation to Nivelt typically involved several families riding together in the back of an open truck. To amuse themselves during the ride, parents and children alike would sing left-oriented material such as the socialist anthem, Solidarity. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, American folk music performers such as Paul Robeson, Guy Carawan, and Pete Seeger were regular visitors to Camp Nivelt. Clearly, Gray and the other members of the Travelers were born into a community and heritage that valued both socialist politics and singing, so much so that Gray told me he assumed the two naturally just went hand in hand. In 1949, when Gray was all of 15, a number of Camp Nivelt veterans, whose parents sang in the Toronto Jewish Folk Choir, got together and in emulation of Pete Seeger's recently formed group, the Weavers, decided to sing on the picket lines for striking General Motors and Ford workers in Oshawa and Windsor. Amongst this group were future Travelers Sid Doge and Jerry Goodis. Energized by their experiences singing on the picket lines, 2 years later, members of this group formed the Youth Singers of the UJPO. In the summer of '53, 5 of the stronger members of the Youth Singers decided to form a quintet roughly patterned after the Weavers. Now, I nearly was going to leave this out, but I decided I'll keep it in. They actually were going to call themselves the Beavers, somehow thinking that related to Canadiana and tied to the Weavers, but wiser heads prevailing ended up calling themselves the Travelers after Weavers member Lee Hayes' song, Lonesome Traveler, which for several years served as their theme song. I'm going to read you a quote from Jerry Gray from an interview, I guess 9 years ago. "We were going to carry the torch of the blacklisted Weavers. We sang songs of brotherhood and peace when it wasn't good to sing about those things. And Pete Seeger became our patron saint." End of quote. In the fall of 1953, the group worked at expanding their repertoire, playing infrequent gigs in an odd amalgam of labor meetings and university fraternity houses. While the Travelers were thus getting their feet wet, a large number of Canadians were tuning into the first year of television broadcasting by the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Needless to say, much of that first season was pretty hit and miss in terms of quality. While watching a number of what they thought were pretty substandard acts, at least that's how they told me, the Travelers reasoned they could do better. Suitably emboldened, they proceeded to set up an audition with producer Peter McFarlane, who was sufficiently impressed with them to hire them for the budding network's first summer replacement show, The Haunted Studio. With television a new medium, and many of the CBC's earliest programs being variety shows, the Travelers were regularly featured throughout the decade on a number of CBC programs, including Holiday Ranch, Cross Canada Hit Parade, which was modeled after your hit parade from the States, Country Hoedown, Summertime '57, and so on. It was hearing Pete Seeger a little earlier performing at a Labor Day picnic at Toronto's Canadian National Exhibition that inspired Jerry Gray to play the piano. Using Seeger's recently published How to Play 5-String Banjo booklet as a way of getting started, Gray quickly became proficient. For the most part, he used the banjo as a rhythm instrument, which freed Sid Doge up to play a variety of lead lines and fills on a rather unique instrument called the mandocello, substantially enriching the group's overall arrangements. This was an unorthodox combination, banjo and mandocello, but it worked perfectly. I don't know any other group that used this. The banjo's trebly dry and brittle sound provided the perfect foil for the mandocello's lower register and more sustained timbre. And for those who don't know what the mandocello is, it's basically a mandolin, 8 strings, in pairs, tuned in fifths, CGDA, but pitched as a cello down lower. The Travelers' big break came when they won a CBC televised amateur show called Pick the Stars. Up to the semifinals, the winners of Pick the Stars were chosen by the viewing audience. Sounds like American Idol to me. With this in mind, the Travelers wisely elected to play their version of Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land for the first appearance on the show. The group had initially learned the song from both Pete Seeger and Guy Carawan when those two American artists visited Nijveld and the UJPO in 1953 and 1954. And for those who don't know, there's Guy Carawan, less known than Seeger, huge important part of the leftist folk movement, ran the Highlander Folk School, or the music part of it, from 1959 on, and in his role there introduced We Shall Overcome to the Snick Freedom Singers, which of course became the anthem of the civil rights movement. Shortly after they originally learned the song, the idea evolved to adapt it to the Canadian context. Work in progress. While the words evolved over time, eventually the Travelers replaced a number of Guthrie's lyrics, most notably changing the song's chorus from "This land is your land, this land is my land, from Redwood Forest to New York Island, from the snow-capped mountains to Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me." You all know that version. Canadian lyrics. "This land is your land, this land is my land, from Bonavista Vista to the Vancouver Island, from the Arctic Circle to the Great Lake waters. This land was made for you and me." That's how I learned the song when I was 5. Not in grade 5. I was in my backyard in my swings with my brothers and sisters. It was one of dozens of songs we sang. Didn't know who the hell a Traveler was. Didn't know who a Weaver was. Didn't know what Woody Guthrie was. And had no idea there was any other lyrics to such a song. The Travelers also changed the second line of the third verse. Not so important, but for the sake of being complete and accurate, there it is if you want to see it. Everywhere they performed the song, the Travelers' Canadianized version received unbridled rapturous applause. One can get some sense of how deeply the Travelers' version of This Land Is Your Land permeated the national consciousness in Canada in the late 1960s and 70s by examining the holdings of Canada's National Archive and Library. The library has close to 60 recordings of the song, the vast majority of which use the Canadianized lyrics. In fact, only 6 don't. 3 use Guthrie's lyrics, but they're all recorded for American labels, even though they were by Canadian artists. 2 skip the chorus, don't mention place names at all, and 1 refers to place names in Poland, even though it's sung in English, by Polish Canadians, one assumes. The rest, well over 50, all use the Canadianized lyrics. It's interesting to look at who made those recordings. Well, the majority of the records were made by Ontario-based groups, reflecting the geographical distribution of both the country's populace and the record industry. Included in the National Library's collection are versions recorded by ensembles literally from coast to coast, with 2 of the versions recorded in French by Quebec-based ensembles. Evidence of the association of the Canadian version of the song with strong ideas of nationhood and identity can be seen by looking a little further at these recordings. A number of versions in the library's holdings were recorded for the National Centennial celebrations in 1967. Maybe not surprisingly, in the years immediately following that, 8 different versions were recorded by school choirs. 1 from Victoria, 1 from Calgary, 1 from Galt, 1 from Windsor, 1 from Waterloo, and so on, crisscrossing the country. Another 2 were recorded by religious-based choirs, 1 in Toronto, and in the Young Men's Christian Association from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Well, 3 more were sung by the Cambridge Kiwanis Boys Choir, Camp Walden Choir. Camp Walden's a Jewish camp in Ontario. And interestingly enough, tying it into the labor movement, in the early 1970s by the General Motors Choir in Oshawa. There are also 2 recordings using the Travelers' lyrics aimed at children. There were Italian, German, and Ukrainian language recordings sung by Italian, German, and Ukrainian Canadians of the song using the Travelers' lyrics. And there's a recording, I love this one, celebrating the left-wing politics of Tommy Douglas, entitled "A Douglas for Me and Other Songs of the New Democratic Party" by Joe Glazer. And I assume many of the Americans in the House won't know who Tommy Douglas was. He was the premier of Saskatchewan, led a party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation Party. This is in the 40s and 50s. His government was the first democratic socialist government in North America. And this is really timely given what's happening south of the border. His government introduced the continent's first single-payer universal health care program. in 1961, his party and another left party came together, formed a new NDP, or New Democratic Party. What did they sing at the founding convention? The Travelers' version of This Land Is Your Land. The Travelers' version of Guthrie's song also appeared in the 12-page government booklet entitled This Land Is Your Land, published by the Centennial Commission. And it was used as part of an educational package put together by the Alberta Learning Resources Project for their Canadian Neighborhoods Unit. In the early 1960s, the Travelers added a French verse, an attempt to make the song even more Canadian. Perhaps the first song to truly celebrate Canada in its lyrics, the Travelers' adaptation of Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land became a part of Canada's folk heritage, being sung at camps, at schools, and in family picnics by people like myself who had no idea who the Travelers were or that the song had originally been written by an American. And I got to share this with you. My daughter said, "What are you going to Edmonton for?" I said, "I'm speaking at this blah, blah." "What are you speaking about?" "This land is your land." I sang that at camp. I had no idea she'd sung it. And I said to her, "Which lyrics did you sing?" And I showed her both the American and the Canadian chorus. She had no idea the American chorus even existed. She had learned the Canadian words, no idea who, she's heard Woody Guthrie because of Bob Dylan, but she didn't know This Land Is Your Land and didn't connect it to him. If the Travelers had never done anything else, their rewriting of one of Woody Guthrie's greatest songs would have assured them a place in Canadian cultural history. Well, all that is to the good. The Travelers' version of This Land Is Your Land inadvertently contributed to the sanitization of Guthrie's song. Seeger and Carwin had only taught the group the 4 verses that Guthrie had originally recorded in 1944, all of which easily resonate with an uncritical celebration of the United States, or in the Travelers' case, Canada. Now, Bob made a good point. In many ways, if the complete lyrics had been sung back then, maybe this song couldn't have traveled, no pun intended, the way it did and become so universal in the McCarthy era. It's interesting that Guthrie only recorded those 4 verses initially. He did the other version we all know. In fact, I've got the lyrics here. Guthrie did a 5th verse on another version for Moash shortly thereafter. We don't have the recording date. That's the no trespassing verse. And there's also, of course, this verse that now we know a lot of people. Pete began singing it, I think in the late 60s. Arlo began singing it. You talked about the Obama thing. And of course, Neil Young recently put it on the Americana CD. And if you haven't heard Neil Young's grunge version of it, you need to hear it. It's exceptional. But then Neil's exceptional. We all know that. Jerry Gray told me that when he wrote the Canadian lyrics, or when the Travelers wrote the Canadian lyrics, they were completely unaware of these additional verses. Unfortunately, the group never had a chance to meet Guthrie. Oddly enough, he never visited Niveld, despite all these other left American singers coming up. And I did some research on that. Searched digitally all the major Canadian newspapers' holdings under the word Woody Guthrie. And it appears he came to Hamilton in the 40s, played on 2 picket lines, didn't do any paid concerts, and I'm not sure he ever played any other time in Canada. And Gray is doubtful that Guthrie was ever aware that their adaptation of the song for a Canadian audience was heard by Guthrie. Although I wonder about that, given that when Guthrie would come out of the hospital, people apparently were playing him various versions of the songs. Jerry, you never know. He may have gotten to hear it, but we won't know. The Travelers originally recorded This Land Is Your Land for the fledgling Hallmark label in 1957 as part of their debut LP across Canada with the Travelers. While a second Hallmark album, The Travelers Sing Songs in North America, followed in 1959, the group was dissatisfied with Hallmark's lack of marketing and promotional acumen and virtually non-existent distribution. In 1960, the Travelers approached Frank Jones about recording for Columbia Records. Aware of the growing interest in folk music on college campuses and in urban coffee houses across the continent, Jones made the fateful decision to make the Travelers the first folk artist and one of the first artists in any genre ever signed to Columbia's Canadian branch. That means ever signed to a major label in this country. Over nearly 7 years, the Travelers recorded 5 albums for Columbia. And after departing the label in late '66, they recorded a half-dozen additional albums for a variety of independent companies. The Travelers' contribution to Canadian nationalism and identity extends beyond just writing Canadian lyrics for This Land Is Your Land. In their concerts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Travelers typically would play only Canadian material in the first half of the show, where after the intermission, the group would showcase the repertoire of international material. Let me read you another quote from Jerry Gray from our interview. "We did the whole first half, and we'd say just before it ended, 'Did you know that every single one of the songs that we've sung were Canadian?' What we were trying to do was educate Canadian people to the fact that there are Canadian songs. Here's a group that could do a whole program made up entirely of Canadian content. We looked on ourselves, maybe haughtily, as the great white knights for Canadian folk music, end of quote. Much of the Travelers' Canadian repertoire had been originally collected by folklorists such as Edith Folk, Marius Barbeau, and Helen Creighton in songbooks such as these, and could be found in published songs, or more typically, amongst the hundreds of hours of field tapes these cultural workers had deposited in various Canadian archives. Our intention is to sing the songs that are sung by the people, about the people, stated Gray in a 1958 newspaper interview. We think folk songs shouldn't be hiding in libraries. They should be around for everyone to sing. Without groups like us, he added 2 years later in another newspaper interview, these great songs would be lost. By our singing them, they are passed on to the public who learn and sing them too. This way they once again become living Canadian songs adapted by the people, end of quote. Over the course of their career, the Travelers have continued to perform a rich repertoire of songs of social consciousness, songs that celebrate and reflect the cultural and regional diversity of their native Canada, and songs drawn from various other countries worldwide. In the process, they kick-started the Canadian folk revival, and with their version of This Land Is Your Land, played an integral role in helping to ferment a strong sense of national pride and identity. Thank you. And thanks to Jerry Gray.